I first met Rabbi Matis because I was a Rebbe at the Yeshiva High School of Queens and had to get out to Queens from Monsey every single day. He worked at a government office in Lefrak City in Regal Park, so someone put us together and I went with him to Queens every single day. We left Monsey at 5:20. He davened with a 6:30 minyan at the Queens Jewish Center, and very often I would go home with him as well. In all the years that I went into the city with Rabbi Matis in the pre-dawn hours, he never once was even a minute late. Now, I occasionally overslept, but the thought never occurred to him to call and leave or whatever. He would bang on the windows of my house, and my children remember this to this day, of Matis banging on all the windows, trying to wake somebody up, because he was not going to go to the city without me. He felt that responsibility. So my kids still make fun of him, screaming, Rabbi Mayer, banging on the windows, because he felt the achrayas to get me to the city. My first impressions of Rabbi Matis were that he was just a sort of balabatish fellow from Monsey, nothing out of the ordinary. But very quickly I discovered that he was quite extraordinary. Rav Hutner, in a letter somewhere, writes that to a fellow who was leaving yeshiva, that he felt he was just going from one room in a house to another. Rav Hutner said, no, you're going from one part of the room to another part of the room. And Rabbi Matis was perhaps the greatest incarnation of a Ben Torah with Yiras Shamayim, with Yediyas HaTorah, with intellectual sophistication, who was also a working man, working in a government office surrounded by incompetence. There was never a subject I raised with him in learning when he did not come back the next day or the day after next at most, having looked it up. I mentioned some question, he'd go home, look it up, come back the next day. Sometimes he'd bring a sefer to me which discussed that subject. Any question and learning that arose was his personal responsibility to research, reflect upon, and bring back to me, and I'm sure to dozens, if not hundreds of others. He was also, Matis was a most eclectic man, so that there were many areas of Torah wisdom whose svarim are now on my shelves that I was guided to by him. And sources as diverse as Slabodka Musa and Polish Hasidus. When he discovered that I didn't own the Tenuas Musa, but Dov Katz, he was shocked. And of course, I had to get out and get myself a Tenuas Musa, so I had to discuss intelligently with him the Musa movement. Similarly, Polish Hasidus. I mean, I knew the Chedush Harim, the Sfas Emes, but Rabbi Matis was particularly fond of Ishbitz Radzim. So I had to make a pilgrimage again to S. Goldman's Svarim store on the Lower East Side and stock up in the Mayer Schiller and the Sod Yesharim and the Beis Yaakov and all the Svarim that he was well versed in, which I had barely heard of until that point. So Slobodka, Radzin were just the tip of the iceberg. Rabbi Matis also introduced me to the world of Rav Kook. And I think this is important to note, because Rabbi Matis was an independent thinker. And although the world he had been brought up in was moving increasingly away from Rav Kook, note Rav Hutner's taking down his picture from his sukkah, which was a source of great pain to Rabbi Matis, but Rabbi Matis remained independent and was devoted to Rav Kook. I think if there was any force which shaped him, which he constantly went back to, it was Rav Kook. And he introduced him to all Rav Kook's Svarim. We learned them together for a certain period of time. He also taught them in Or Torah in Queens, where I was a Rebbe at that time. He came and gave a shiur there to some Talmidim late afternoon in the Svarim of Rav Kook. He selected certain letters which he thought were important for the Talmidim to learn. Now here I think we have to note, as I said before, independence of thought. Rabbi Matis Greenblatt was a fierce religious Zionist. Fierce. And I am inclined to say not just a religious Zionist. Any form of right-wing Zionism was something that he felt was positive, brought people to Jewish pride, should be cherished. So he could speak affectionately about Jabotinsky. He could speak very affectionately about Menachem Begin. So I'd say he was a right-wing religious Zionist, but also independently a right-wing Zionist. And this he maintained throughout his life. He kept a picture of Cook in his dining room here in Monsey, and no matter how many schnorrers, no matter how many guests of his question this, and that's, I think, a great indication of his independence of thought. If he concluded that something was correct, it was going to remain correct, and the forces of history were not going to deter him. Matis believed very strongly that marriage should be based upon a personal relationship, and that one should explore that relationship pre-marriage. The notion of families arranging a shidduch was not something he looked positively upon. And no matter how many times I would tell him that that was the way Jews got married for time immemorial, and no matter how many times I would tell him that was the way non-Jews got married for time immemorial, he wasn't budging. It was one of those areas where he felt the world had progressed to a certain point and had improved upon that which once was. He was not absolutely subservient to tradition in that regard. Now I'm going to reveal something which I think nobody watching this video actually is aware of. Most of you think that Matis was indifferent to the world of sports, but I now feel the time has come to reveal that Matis was a baseball fan, and as bizarre and quizzical as it was, a boy living in Brooklyn, he was a Yankees fan. And I remember him talking to me about the late 1940s Yankees, particularly Tommy Henrich, who was the Yankees' first baseman at that time. He was a pretty good player, Tommy Henrich. And Matis always said to me, he wasn't just a good ball player, Tommy Henrich was a mensch. And that's what he emphasized to me constantly. But he had a big kiss in the late 1940s New York Yankees. Who would have thought? The most surprising thing about Matis is that a person could be working 8 hours a day, but yet have his Torah be his kavah and his malacha his arai. The Rabbi Matis Greenblatt was not just an eclectic yeshiva man, was not just somebody who took from Hasidus and Musar, but he was also a fairly sophisticated intellectual. On his shelves were a complete set of Tradition magazine. And he would often speak about modern Orthodox thinkers, sometimes critically, sometimes favorably, but he was the kind of philosopher which most philosophers aren't. He really was willing to think, to explore, to read, to probe, and he was one of the most sincere intellectuals that I ever encountered.